start the process, you actually do something called milling in, which is as simple as just cracking the grain open to expose the starches inside. For a big batch of beer, like you're saying, you're typically going to crack open about 4,000 pounds of grain. That's going to sit in that grist case in the room, in the mill room. Most of it, usually between 40, sometimes up to 60, even up to 80% of the actual product is going to be Pel Turo. But sometimes you have to get a little fancier. That's all the other bags that are in the room. There's some grains with acidic treatment, honey treatment, some that will add a chocolate flavor, some that are just for color. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff you can add together to change the color and the mouthfeel of your beer. So whenever that's cracked open, we're going to send it back to a container called the mash tun, and that's whenever we're going to add water.
4th of July, we had the fly.
To do that, it has to pass by our 2 liquor tanks. There's a hot and cold liquor tank, which liquor in a brewery is just a fancy word for water. The cold is kept at about 40 degrees, the hot's kept at around 180, and we're going to combine those 2 temperatures of water or liquor and also take into account the ambient temperature of the grain to hit something called our strike temperature for the liquor that we're using. That's where the grain's going to be the happiest and is going to make the most sugar for us. You're typically going to float between like 150 to 155, and it really depends on the style. And so the strike water that you're actually bringing over from the liquor tanks is typically going to be 160 to 165. So whenever you combine those 3 things, it's going to sit right at that temperature that you want it to be in the mash tun.
Back to southern skies.
So that's going to sit in there usually about 45 minutes to an hour and go through something called satrification rest, which is a very fancy word for just converting all of these starches that we've exposed by cracking the grain open. It's going to start converting all that starch into long and short grain sugars. Whenever that process is done, we're left with something that's the consistency of like really, really wet, lumpy oatmeal. It's going to have the smell of almost like a sweet tea with corn almost. It's a really wonderful smell. We got to get all that grain out of there now. We've done everything that we want with it. So to do that, we're going to take all of that product that we made back in the mash tun. We're going to bring it up to the next container called the lauter tun. It has a screen false bottom on it. That allows us to do a few things in that one tank. For one, we're going to start something called a Vorlauf, pretty right off the bat. Start pulling the liquid off the bottom, which at this point is called wort or unfermented beer. We're going to start pumping it off the bottom, and we're going to start sprinkling it back on top of itself, on top of the grain bed. All the husks that were left intact just from cracking the grain open also make a really, really great self-filter. So whenever we first start, the wort's real cloudy. It's got little stuff floating around inside of it. Just by filtering it back on top of itself, it becomes very clear. And it's almost going to be just about the color of what your final product's going to be if you're not adding a lot of fruit and stuff at the end. So that's going to last for maybe just about 15-20 minutes. And whenever that's done, we're going to start transferring that wort back to the boil kettle. Our transfers are going to typically probably be 30 to 45 minutes back to the boil kettle. And whenever that's done, we can start turning the burners on, or we have these steam jackets that are inside of the big kettle. So we're going to turn those on, but we have a big problem. We still have a bunch of grain in the lauter tun. It hasn't gone anywhere, and it's a waste product for us now. Most places have to throw that stuff away, but what's really great for us is we have people who want to come pick it up, and we give it to them for free. The coolest one is the Bethesda Academy. Here in town, they're a not-for-profit school, and they have a farming initiative for young farmers, and so they use it on their farm. They use it to feed pigs and use it in compost, all kinds of stuff. So the grain goes out the door, and now we have our nice wort in our boil kettle, and it's going to be brought up to a nice rolling boil, and that's whenever we add our next product to the beer, and that is hops. Hops are a bittering plant, and they will kind of counteract the actual sugar or the sweetness of the sugar water. Anytime you add a hop pretty much at the beginning of the boil, it's going to be almost strictly for bitterness. Anything added towards the maybe 20 minutes left in the boil mark is going to be for a little bit of bitterness and a whole lot of flavor. Anything towards the end or after the flame out is going to be almost strictly an aroma hop. So a boil is going to last for typically just about 60 minutes. Some will take a little longer. We have a lot of stuff in there again. We've added a lot of hop residue. So we take it up to another container called the whirlpool. We're going to take all that still pretty hot above 200-degree wort and transfer it over to the whirlpool. We start pumping it out, and then there's a little elbow inside, and it's going to make that wort start spinning. Whenever that happens and kind of does this double vortex thing, it's going to pull anything floating left inside there to the middle and make it fall to the bottom. And we're going to be ready to send that over to fermentation, but we have to actually get the temperature down first because it's still pretty hot. So we're going to send it through a heat exchanger, and that's going to be able to take that really super heated wort that we still have in the whirlpool, and it's going to bring it down to about 72 degrees. So while we're pumping that through, we've already loaded yeast down into the bottom cone part of the fermentation tanks, and we're going to start pumping that wort in from the brew floor. So once we pump all that in there with a glycol system, we're going to bring the temperature up, usually between 68 to 75 degrees. Most of the beers I've done have been sitting around at 68 to 72. Whenever we do that, the yeast come to life. They start waking up and they start munching on all that sugar that we made in there. And when the yeast munch on all that sugar, they make ethyl alcohol and CO2. The ethyl alcohol, of course, is the fun part of what we're doing. So it's going to be about a week and a half to 2 weeks. But there's one more thing we got to do. We really like our fizzy carbonated beer, so we have to do one more thing, and that's forced carbonation. We're going to pump all of that beer now over to something called a bright tank, or it says BBT on it. And we're going to open up a food grade CO2 line, and we're going to start force carbonating at a fairly, I think, above 20 psi. It's just going to start slamming that into there. Whenever that process is done, it's the same product at that point as what you're going to pull out of a tap or open a can. That's our finished product in that tank. Unfortunately, that won't fit into most people's houses or bars, so we have to put it into some smaller containers. So we do keg here in house, which is typically what's going out to all the bars in the southeast. We bottle. Whenever we do some of our more specialty seasonals, we'll put them in bottles, and we also can.
Blue white waves cross the shores. We walk hand in hand towards the sand. With you by my side, I know that there ain't nothing we can't do.
Cracking that grain open to actually putting in whatever container it's going out in the world. Everything's been done here in house. We don't contract out, we don't contract in. If you've had a Southbound product, it's been made in this building. So it's something we're pretty proud of.